Alright, so in this video it's just going to be a recording of the CRUD delivery app that we created in person. So this is just a video that you can use to follow up if you missed that session. So we're going to create a new project and we're just going to call this let's call it demo delivery. It's in Java, Maven. You can set your group ID to whatever you want. Change this to an underscore. Use dash instead. Then I'm going to use this as leave this as JDK22, and our Java version will be Java 17. So if you don't have IntelliJ Ultimate Edition for you to be able to create the project like this, you can just go to start.spring.io and just follow the same process that we did in person. So once we fill this information, you can now click next. Then we come to web, select Spring Web, then we add Lombok, developer tool. Then we're now going to come to SQL and add Spring Data JPA. So Spring Data JPA is going to allow us to conveniently access our database. Then we're going to be using MySQL database, so we're going to add the MySQL driver, which is going to allow us to connect to the database. And if we have time, we're going to be using TimeLeaf, right, for the interface. So these are basically the packages we need right now. We're not using Spring Security right now, but these are the packages that we need. So I'll just click create, and we bring this over. So we have our project, our Spring project created. So I'll close this README. So if you come to the pom.xml, you're going to see a lot of configuration, right? The Spring version we're using, the Spring Boot version we're using. Then information about our project, which is the project name, the group ID, etc. All this stuff we discussed earlier. Then we have some dependencies here, which are the dependencies that we added. Spring Data JPA. We have TimeLeaf, we have Web, we have Lombok, and MySQL connector -j, right? So if you want to add more dependencies, you can add more dependencies here. You just go to Maven repository, find the dependency you're looking for, and add it here. So now let's expand our source. So we have test. If you want to write test, you can write your test within this package. Then within the main folder is where we write our user-facing code. So we now have our resources. We have static, where you can put your images, CSS, JavaScript, and so on. Then we have templates, where our HTML file is going to reside, using the TimeLeaf templating engine. Now we have application.properties. So application.properties, in this case, you can either have application.properties or you can change this to YAML, but we're going to leave it as the default. So you set the configuration for your application here. So we're going to set the database connection here, Spring data source. We're going to set the URL, which is Java database connector connecting to MySQL, and this is going to be at localhost. So this is the default port for MySQL. So I'm going to call the database demo underscore delivery. Spring database username is going to be root. We're just going to use the root user. If you have another user, you can use your other user. So we now have Spring data source dot password. I missed an equal sign here. Yeah. So you can insert your password here. So for me, I'm just going to leave that for later. Then you can have spring dot jpa hibernate URL-auto to update. So it's just going to update our database whenever we run this program. Then we need to set our dialect. Hibernate. So our dialect is MySQL dialect, since we're using MySQL database. So I'm also going to add some login here so that we can see what is going on in the database, just in case we have some issues. So hibernate. So I'm going to set this to debug. Then the type is going to be trace. So this just allows us to see when Hibernate is generating or manipulating data on our behalf. Since Hibernate is the object relational mapper, there are things that are out of our control that are handled by Hibernate, so we get to see some of those things, and even when there are errors, we get to see what those are. So we are done with this. However, this our database does not exist yet, so we're going to just create the database. So for me, the database tool I use is SQL Ace. If you're using XAMPP, WAMP and so on, you can just create database the same way you do, right? As long as the port is still pointing to port 3306. So I'm going to name this demo underscore delivery, and I'll click add. At that stage, we've created our database. So I'm going to go ahead and enter my password, then we come. So I've entered my password, and if you don't have password, you can just leave it empty. So right now I'm going to create a package, and I'm going to call these entities. And within our entities, we have two entities that we're concerned about, which is the vehicle entity and then we have the item entity. So we have different vehicles that can take our items and deliver them to their respectful users. So we're going to annotate this vehicle with an entity. So the entity just tells Hibernate to well, let me start with let me just come over and start with the vehicle. It just tells Hibernate to create a database table for this particular class. So if you want to set the name of the table, you can do this and set, if you want to call it vehicle, maybe table like this. So it's going to just create this table for you. But if you don't set it, it's just going to use the name of the class. So now we need to create our properties. So we need to have an ID in our database, and we're going to set the generated value. The strategy is called to generated type. Just generate it sequentially. We're going to have private long ID, and our errors are gone, so we can now set the other properties for the vehicle. So our vehicle is going to have a name, it's going to have a plate number, going to have a status. So the status is just basically what's the current state of this vehicle. Is it in maintenance? Is it spoiled? But we're just using strings for now. Private string type. So what type of vehicle is it? Is it a truck, a sedan, a motorbike, and so on? Private, let's have a float for fuel capacity. Private, so we're going to have the carrying weight. So what's the weight of a package that this car can carry? So we're going to leave this as it is right now. Then we come to our item. So we're going to repeat a couple of steps here. We have to create an ID, and we have to set the strategy to generate it sequentially. So private long ID. So now that we've done this, we need to also set a couple of properties for the properties that our item is going to have. So typically the key thing we need is private string, the name of the package, then private float, we need weight. So we're going to use the weight to calculate, to know how many items we can actually put in our vehicle. So the more we add items to the vehicle, the more we calculate the weights, and just know if it's more than the carrying weight, or if it's going to pass the carrying weight, then we can say we can't take this. Then we also have a private string code, or maybe I should call this item code. I think it's implied since this is within the items class. So we have code, right? Now our item has a relationship with the vehicle, and that relationship itself is a one-to-many relationship. A vehicle can have one-to-many items. So we can have private list, so a list of items. So I can just call this items. So let me just import the list class. So I can now set the relationship to one-to-many. So one vehicle has many, or a list of items. So at this stage, what we've successfully done is we've created that relationship in our database. Now we're not done. We need to also have some getters and setters, so that we can get these attributes of our vehicle and the items, and we can actually set them. We can update them using their setters, since they are all private. So using Lombok, we can now do add getter, add setter. So Lombok is going to automatically generate those for us. So the alternative to doing that is you can come to generate and select all this and generate, and you have all this boilerplate repetitive code, right? So instead of us having so many lines of code, we just have these 2 lines of code that's replaced all those lines of code. So we're going to do the same thing for the constructors. We're going to have a no args constructor and an all args constructor. So let's come back to the items class. We can add our getter, we can add our setter, we can add our all args constructor and our no args constructor. So at this stage, I believe we are done with our entities. So let's run our application and see what we have. So I'll enable. So if you don't enable this annotations processing, you may have to enable it in the settings. Otherwise, Lombok these annotations will not work, and you have to generate the getters and setters and the constructors, or write them in the code, right? So if you're using IntelliJ and you don't enable that, you may have situations where you can't get a particular value or update particular other values. So all you have to do is to come here and by the way, I'm just pressing Command N or Control N to get this up. So you can select getter and setter, and from there you can now proceed to generating them, or you can just type them if you want. You can also do the same thing for the constructor. So our application is running, so you can see. So let's come back to our database and refresh. So you can see we have our items table, we have our vehicles table, we have our relationship, right? Vehicle ID and item ID. So if we have one vehicle carrying 10 items, now let's say vehicle with ID 1 carrying 10 items, you're going to see 1 10 times, and you're going to see the ID of all those other items here. Come to think of it, I think in this case a set itself may be more efficient than a list, since each item itself is unique. So we are done with our entities. Let's proceed to creating our repositories. So the repository is just the part of the design pattern, or repository. It's a part of our architecture that connects our code to the database. So we're going to create an interface, and we're going to call this vehicle repository. And this is going to extend JPA repository, and we're going to pass our generic type, which is vehicle, and it's the type of its primary key, which is long. So the beauty of this is JPA is going to generate all the boilerplate CRUD operations, database operations for us. So we don't have to write some basic queries or directly speak to our database, right? So some of those basic commands that you need, like to create a new vehicle, to update, to delete, and so on, create, delete, whatever, they are they are all taken care of by the JPA repository. So we are going to see an example of that, but let's just create our item repository. So let's have item repository. So similarly, this is going to extend JPA repository, and is going to be of type item, and this is also long. So so we've successfully created our repositories, and once we've done this, we have some basic CRUD operations, and you can also write, as you can see, it's an interface, so the methods here are going to be abstract, which means they have no body. So you can also have stuff like this. So if you want to get a list of vehicles, get vehicle by carrying weight greater than a particular number, so you can say float weight. So you want to get, so if you pass it maybe 500 here, maybe 500 kilograms, for example, right? If you want to get all the vehicles, I can get that just by writing this method like this, right? Following this naming pattern, which is very, very easy to read. Get vehicle by carrying weight greater than weight, right? We don't have to write the query for this. It's already done for us by Hibernate through JPA. So also, if you want to write your own query, you feel you want to be more efficient, right? Writing your own query, you can write your own query using the @query annotation, then followed by maybe what you expect the return type of this to be. So if you are selecting a list of vehicles, then you're going to have a list of vehicles, then you can write a custom function or method here, right? Then your query is going to be here within quotes. So if I want to get vehicles status like this, so I can now write my query here. I can say select select vehicle from vehicle where vehicle so whatever the status is, you can say maintenance. So you can have this, let's see, cannot resolve type vehicle. So let me change this to status yeah. So I think the issue was the name. The name has to match. I was writing this as if I was writing query commands, but this has to match the class we're making reference to. So this is going to select vehicles from the vehicle table where the vehicle status is in maintenance. So so we can do that. So let's add one more. So let's just get a vehicle. This is getting a single vehicle now. Get vehicle by plate number, and we'll just get, so this is if we're trying to get a particular vehicle by its plate number. So this is going to return that for us. So now we're done with our repository. So the next thing we have to do now is to create a service layer. So we're going to create a new package. I'm going to call this services. So within our service, we're going to have a service, a vehicle service. So the vehicle service is just going to be an interface, not a class. An interface. So basically, if you recall, an interface is just basically a contract that our that whatever class implements that particular interface has to implement this method. So you assign a contract to say, okay, if I am a vehicle, right, it means I have the particular properties of this particular interface. So now what we want is we want to be able to create a vehicle. So we have our create vehicle method. We also want to be able to update a vehicle. And we're just going to pass in the ID of the vehicle we want to update. Then let's see, the new instance of that vehicle that we want to replace the old one with. We may also want to get a list of all our vehicles. So I'll call this get all vehicles. we also want to get a vehicle by plate number. Lastly, we want to delete our vehicle. So for this, let's just return nothing. So we can return void. I can say delete vehicle. Then so we can have this. So now we have our interface. We need to have the vehicle service implementation, which is the next one we're going to do. This is going to be a class vehicle service implementation, and is going to implement the vehicle service. So once we implement the vehicle service, we now have to also implement the methods of that service. So we're going to implement methods. I'm going to implement all the methods. So for us to create our vehicle and to perform all these basic database related operations, we need our repository, because our repository is what has direct access to our database. So we're going to have a private final vehicle repository, and we're going to initialize it using the constructor. So basically we're using a constructor to inject this dependency, which is our vehicle repository. Another option would have been to use at AutoWired, but the constructor based injection is more efficient. So for us to create our vehicle, all we have to do now is to say vehicle repository dot save, and what are we saving? We're saving the instance of the vehicle, which is this vehicle, right? So we don't have our controllers yet, but at this stage we can actually write a record to our database for to create a particular vehicle. The next we'll move to, let's keep the update for now, then let's do vehicle repository dot find all. So this is going to just give us all our vehicles. In this case, remember, if you come to our vehicle repository, we have this method that helps us get a vehicle by plate number. So let's come back to our implementation, and we can now use that. So we can say vehicle repository dot get vehicle by plate number, and we can pass in the plate number, and this is just going to return that particular vehicle with that plate number for us. So if you notice, Hibernate and GPA has greatly reduced the amount of code I've written to perform some of these queries, right? So the issue of optimization is something that can be discussed later, but for something as that we're trying to bootstrap real quickly, you can see how fast this makes it. So now let's come to update. So so for the update, if we create our vehicle, let's say new vehicle, and say we want to get, let's say we want to get the original vehicle. So we say this dot repository, then we want to find by ID, right? I will enter the ID here. So this is not going to work because what is being returned is it's not a vehicle, but it's an optional type. So these optional types allows us to check or to handle cases where we get maybe like a null object returned, right? So for us to do this, we now have to change this to an optional type, and the type of this optional is going to be a vehicle, right? So I can just call this optional vehicle. So with this optional, now we can say if optional vehicle is present, that means it's not null, right? We can now perform our update. We can now say vehicle, can now create a new vehicle, vehicle, then we can also set so we can now set the name of the vehicle to vehicle.getName so get items. So basically what we are doing is we found our vehicle in a database, and whatever the user supplies, right, either through APIs or through a UI front end, right, we are using that now to change what is within the content of that particular item, right? So we're updating this record with what is supplied from this update vehicle. So we can now do vehicle repository dot save new vehicle. So we'll save after the update. We can then return new vehicle. Then we can have else. We can decide to throw an exception here. See, so we can just throw a runtime exception. Let's see, throw new runtime exception. That's a record not found. Then for our delete, it's very simple. We can just say vehicle repository dot delete by ID. We can just pass in the ID. So at this stage we are done with our repository, with our vehicle services. So the reason why we have this is because we're trying to abstract this interface, because we're trying to abstract the logic of these basic operations from the controller when we get to that stage, right? So that's the reason why we are separating this. So what we're going to do now is we're going to create the service for the items. We're going to say new interface. We're going to have item service, and for this all we just want to do is we need to create an item, and we just need item. Then we want to be able to get an item, get item by ID. So I'm going to pass in a long ID here. Then we want to get a list of items, of all our items. Get all items. We may not implement all these methods, but let's just have them just in case. Then void delete item. And we need the ID of the item we wish to delete. So once we have this, we can now move further to create our item service implementation, and this is going to extend the item service just like the vehicle implementation extends the vehicle service. So I'm going to implement the methods as well. Let's see, implement, that's the correct thing, not extend. Extend is for inheritance. We want to implement this service. So now have private final item repository. So we need to initialize this, which we're going to initialize using the constructor. Then we can now create it the same way we created the last one. So item repository dot save. I want to save an item. Then for get item by ID, we now do item repository dot find by ID. I will now pass in this particular ID. So let's see. So we're getting an optional here. So all we can do is just add dot get. So this is going to return the object for us. Then for this we can say find item repository dot find all. It's going to get us the list, and do delete by ID. So at this stage we are done with the implementation of our service. Now we need to create our controller. So I'm going to have this as controllers. So now we have our services. So just to recap, right, we created our entities, which are the models of the objects we are dealing with in this particular project. We have a delivery system, and we have vehicles, and these vehicles deliver items, right? So a single vehicle can deliver multiple items, so we have a one-to-many relationship. Then we made our entities tables, and to interact with them on the database, we have our repositories, which is connected to interacts to the database using Hibernate through Spring JPA. Then we now have our services that handles the business logic of the application, which is basically creating items, getting all our items, and so on. You can do more complicated things there. And we abstracted our service into an interface and an implementation. And the reason why we did that is because the logic itself should be separated from the should not interact with the controllers. So when we start writing our controller, you realize that we don't create an instance of service implementation, but rather service item. And going through this, I just realized that we need to annotate this with @service. So let's go to the vehicle as well, @service. So let's come to our repository, item repository. You can annotate this with @repository. Same thing with the vehicle, @repository. So let's create our controller. So I'll just create Java class. I'll call this vehicle controller class. So I can now make this a REST controller. So a REST controller is just for we're just going to create a couple of endpoints that can interact with this as a REST API. So I can add request mapping. So I'm adding this request mapping so that I can prefix all our endpoints with a particular tag. So I can call this so this will be /API/ version 1 / vehicle. So our endpoint is going to be localhost colon 8080, which is what the port Spring runs on. Then /API/ vehicle. Then our endpoints will be listed after that. So let's create our services first. So our private final item service, our private final vehicle service. So we're going to initialize this as well using constructors. So we now have access to our service, which means we can perform all the operations within the vehicle service implementation. So now let's create our create method. So we're going to have a response, a post mapping, since we are posting data, right? Then our endpoint. So our endpoint is going to be create vehicle. So the return type of this method is going to be a response entity of type vehicle, right? Because we are returning, our create method returns a vehicle. So create vehicle So as the argument for this method, what we want is the vehicle object. So if we come back to our create method, you can see create vehicle here, and what we want is the vehicle instance, right? So we're going to have at request body. So our request body should have a type vehicle. So once we do this, we can now say vehicle service dot create vehicle, right? So with this now we've created our vehicle, but we now have to return response entity, but we now have to return our vehicle object. So with this, we should be able to successfully create our vehicle once we hit this endpoint. So this endpoint should have a slash here. So we're going to be using like a couple of HTTP methods in this class, right? In this particular vehicle controller class, because we are sending and receiving data over HTTP. So this is the post mapping. The post mapping is for sending data to our server, while the get mapping is to receive. We have put for updates and so on. We have delete, patch, etc. Right? So now let's go to Postman now and test this. So I think we have one of those bugs that we faced earlier. So let's go back to our vehicle class. Then let me just create the getter and setters. So let me just generate them. Then I'm going to remove this to save myself coming back and forth. We'll come to this class as well and generate the getters and setters. So let's try running this again and see what we have. So our application is running. So we can now come to Postman. With Postman, we can now create a new blank collection, and I'll call this demo delivery. Then I'll add a request, and our request will be create vehicle. Then we can have localhost 8080 let me come to the controller and just copy this. So the other endpoint we're trying to get to, so this is our base path now in this particular API. So we're trying to hit this endpoint, so we're going to have create vehicle. So once we have this now, remember our method type, our HTTP method type here is post, right? So we have to change this from get to post since we are sending this particular piece of data. Now our request body, we have to set our request body here, and by default Spring JPA expects JSON, so that's why from this none I'm changing this to raw and I'm leaving it as JSON. You can configure for XML, text and so on, but I'm just going to leave it as JSON, which is default. If you want to fill form, use the form data and enter the key and the value and so on. You can do that using the form data, but for me I'm just going to use JSON. So we'll use JSON now to create the object. So this is our object. We now have to go, let me just go to the vehicle class so that I can see everything we need. So we need name, so let's call this Toyota J5, then our plate number, we just have ABC, let's see KJ, status, maintenance, then well, type first, say boss, fuel capacity, let's see, it's at 70%. Carrying weight, and this is, let's see, 300 kilograms, right? So we've added the name, the plate number, status, type. So let's test our endpoint and see if it works. So we send this and we have the response, right? So we have our response, our object has been created. So we can come to our database to confirm. So we have the carrying weight 300 kilograms, capacity, fuel capacity 70, blah blah blah, right? So we have that now done. If you want to create another object, I can just use the same, I can just say Toyota Camry, change this to 7, active, sedan, carrying weight, let's make this 100 kilograms, and for capacity is at 80. So we can send that and we should have the second record in our database. So we successfully created the vehicle in our database, right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to write the method to get vehicle by plate number. So this is now going to be a get mapping, and we're going to have our endpoint, and it's going to be / get vehicle. Then we need to pass in plate number as our path variable. So we now have a response entity. So we're just going to get a vehicle. So get vehicle by plate number, and we're going to have a path variable, and this is going to be of type long, and the name is going to be plate number. So let me see, this is not getter but get mapping. So these two names have to match, this plate number and this, so that way Spring knows that this particular argument is what is passed in your path, right? So you can now create a vehicle object. Vehicle is equal to vehicle service dot get vehicle by plate number. We can pass in our plate number of string here. This is supposed to be a string, not a long. Then we can return response entity, okay, vehicle. So I return our vehicle object if it's found. So let's come back to Postman. So I'll put the database and Postman side by side. Then let's create a new request. So just ignore the fact that all these are showing get. This is actually a post request, as you can see from here, right? So our new request will also have a get by default. So for some strange reason, Postman is trying to sync with the internet. Okay, it's done. I'll call this get vehicle by plate number. So I'll just copy this path. So then now we now have to add the endpoint. So our endpoint now is get dash vehicle, then we have slash the plate number. So now what plate number are we looking for? So we have ABC 576 KJ, right? So that's the one we're looking for. So we can keep send. So we're getting a 404. So let's see what we've done wrong now. So let's see, get vehicle, okay, let's rerun this. I think it's because we wrote this code without restarting the application. So let's rerun that and send. So you can see we found our Toyota Camry, right? So our get vehicle by plate number works. Now let's go to the next, let's create our next controller now. So we're going to have item controller. So this is going to be at rest controller, and we're going to have at request mapping. So this is going to be slash API slash v1 slash item, right? So in this case, basically what we need is private final item service. So we just need the item service to be able to create the item. So we're going to initialize the item service using the constructor. So we have that. So now what we need is a post mapping and our endpoint. So we're just going to call it create item, then we're going to have a response entity that returns an item, response entity of type item. I can call this create item, and we receive our item through the request body. So we're going to have request body, and it's going to be of type item. So we can now proceed to create our item. So I can call this item let's call it new item is equal to item service, or create item and we can return response entity dot OK new item. So there are certain situations where maybe something wrong is happens, then you may have to have like a condition to check for different things, right? But let's just leave this as it is for now. Let's just create our items. So we'll come back to Postman. We're going to create a new request, and this is going to be create item. And I'll come here and copy the initial part of this endpoint. So I'll change this to item slash create item. Then I'll come to body, set it to raw, and leave it as JSON. So we now create our object. So let's come to the item class to see what the object looks like. So we have name, weight, and code, right? So let's come back to Postman. So we're going to have the name of the item. So let's just call it farming boots. Then our weight, this is 2 grams, 2 kilograms. Then our code, so this code is going to be part of a task that you're going to do, but for now let's just hard code it. So I'll just call it FB2. So let's send this request and see what we get. So just like before, we made the mistake of not restarting the application. So we're going to restart, and let's find our item controller so that we remove that class. So let's try sending again. So it says method not allowed, right? So that's because we have a get here, while in our code we have a post. So I'm going to change this to post and send, and now our boots have been created, right? So if I come back to the item, I'll refresh this, and you can see our item is there. So now we need to be able to add this item now to our vehicle, right? So let's come back to our vehicle controller, and we're now going to have at post mapping. So the endpoint is going to be add item to vehicle. Then we're going to pass in the plate number, because we're going to get the vehicle using its plate number. Then for our item, what we're going to use is our item ID. So we're going to return a response entity of type vehicle, and we're going to have add item to vehicle. So we're going to pass in the path variables. So the path variables are these ones: the plate number and the ID. So our plate number is of type string, so it has to now match the plate number that we have in our path. Then we now have another path variable, and this is of type long and is item ID. So we are first going to get our item, right? So I'm going to say item is equal to item service dot get the item. So I'm going to get the item by ID. Remember, we wrote all this in our service implementation, right? So I'm going to pass in item ID. And next we now have to get our vehicle. So the vehicle that I want to add this item to. Vehicle service dot get vehicle by plate number. So we can now pass in our plate number. So from this vehicle now, we can now do vehicle dot. We're now going to get items. So we're getting all the items in our vehicle. Then we are adding this new item. So we can now add item like this, right? Then we can do vehicle service dot create vehicle. Then so we are basically overwriting the previous vehicle, our previous vehicle that we got here. So once we save, this vehicle that I've added this item to overwrite the old one. So that's why we have this dot create. So we're using our create method to just overwrite it. Return response entity dot OK. Then return our vehicle. So at this stage, we'll be able to add items to the vehicle. So now let's come to Postman and create a new request, and this is going to be add items to vehicle. We change this to post. Let's restart this so that we don't have that issue. Then let's copy this. So all we need now is to pass in what? So we need this path. So add item. So our endpoint is add item to vehicle. So our plate number now is now going to replace whatever plate number of the vehicle we want to add, right? So let's come to vehicle. So let's say we want to add it to this J5 now. So we're going to delete all that and replace it with the plate number of the J5, which is ABC 546 KJ. Then our item now, our item ID. So we'll come back here. Our item ID is 1. So we're going to replace this with 1. So let's send this and see. So once we've done this, notice the item has been added to our J5. So our J5 has this, right? Now let's come back to get vehicle by plate number. So let's change this from the Camry to the J5. So you can see we have this, right? So let's create a new item. So let's call this 2-liter cooking oil, and let's say this weighs 3 kg and 2 LCO. So let's say we have this. So let's send. So we have a new item with ID2, so we can still add that item to this particular vehicle. So I can just add the ID here and send. So now you can see our J5 has farming boots and it also has a delivery for this. All right, so let's refresh our database so you can see the two items. So if you come here now, you can see vehicle 1 now has item 1 and item 2. So this is the relationship. This one vehicle is able to have these two items within it, right? So if you are using SQL Ace, you can always click to go to the vehicle. I can see this is our J5. So if you come here and you click this, you can see it's the farming boots, and if you click the 2, the cooking oil, right? So this is basically just a fast overview of Spring Web, right? We're just building a basic REST API with Spring. So there are going to be some things to follow up, and I'll get back to you on that.